Here's another GTA Online video from Los Santos. I don't know what the video is going to be about. I started watching a 10-hour documentary on Thomas Edison yesterday. I made it 1 hour through that, so I'm going to continue on.
Literary genre in and of themselves. Because Edison says in one of the first notebooks, I am going to make a full record of my career. And so I said to myself, well, knowing the importance of them from a documentation point of view, knowing that if you're going to create a patent, you have to keep a record of the time, the place, the date of the invention. You have to keep a record of who was working on it with you. You have to have a witness for the invention. You have to have the most assiduous documentation when you're trying to create a patent for for the consumer industry. So on that level, the notebooks are important because they are Edison's chronology of his work, but they also contain ideas and half-formed thoughts and sketches and perceptions for other works and other creations that he had thought of that did not become fully realized as in the marketplace. And that's where you get the vision of Thomas Edison's imagination. That's where you get the vision of him as a introspective, creative person. He writes down all the names of all the books he's reading. He writes down the names of people that he meets who give him ideas. He writes down chemicals that he wants to purchase, tools that he wants to purchase. So you get some sense of what direction he's going in his research. I mean, these are really the chronicle of his entire life. And I think that it's significant that he kept writing in these notebooks long after he was able to visit the lab. When he was a sick man, when he was in bed, when he couldn't lift his head off the pillow, he's still writing in the notebooks because it's the process that's important to him, not just the manifestation, not just the thing, but the process of how you get through an idea, how you track your thoughts, and how you monitor your thoughts.
How'd you get interested in him in the first place?
Well, my first two subjects were William Carlos Williams, the poet and physician, and probably you could say the precursor of modern poetry in America today. And the second subject was Man Ray, who was the photographer and painter, who was also a great American figure. And I viewed Man Ray as a quintessential modernist figure. And what I did was, with William Carlos Williams, I was talking about a genre and the history of a genre. And then I decided the most important thing after that would be to try to define a period as a whole, the modern period as a whole. So Man Ray to me was the metaphor for the modernist period in art. And then I thought, well, I've dealt with two highly creative individuals, and I've explored their imaginations. But I wanted to make the point that creativity and imagination are not the sole province of the artist, the humanist thinker. I wanted to show that invention, which was actually defined as an art in Edison's time, was actually called the art of invention. I wanted to show that the inventive process, the creative process, they all stem from the deepest core of the imagination in a human being. And I wanted to connect all those creative processes in the context of an American vision. And if you look at the time frame for these three books, William Carlos Williams, Man Ray, Thomas Edison, they all begin sort of in the last vestiges of the industrial era and the romantic era in culture, and they pass through the cataclysm of the wars, and they end up sort of on the threshold of our day. And so I do think they all connect, even though on first blush it's hard to see the connection, but I think there is a connection.
Where's home for you?
Home for me? Well, I consider myself a native New Yorker since on my mother's side. I have third-generation Manhattanite, and my kids were born in New York City, too. But I live in Upper Montclair, New Jersey, which is right down the street from the Edison lab. So since I spent every Friday at the Edison laboratory for 4 years doing my research, it was very convenient. My travel budget was pretty well under control.
Why'd you pick Fridays?
Well, you see, I have a full-time job as the executive director of the National Book Foundation, which is the sponsor of the National Book Awards. And I run this foundation, which has become quite a large enterprise. The National Book Award is a very prestigious literary prize. And so my writing has always taken place on Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays and vacations, because that's really when I take off from my full-time job. So that's why Fridays are so good, because you can work yourself into the weekend and not interfere with your 40 hours that you have to do for your other jobs.
How big is the National Book Foundation?
Well, the National Book Foundation is small in staff. There are only 4 of us, but our scope has become huge. The submissions by publishers to submit titles to be nominated for the National Book Award has doubled in the past 5 years. And we now give 3 awards for nonfiction, fiction, and poetry. We added poetry a couple of years or 3 years ago. And we also present authors, National Book Award winners, and finalists talking about their work in communities all across the country. We work in settlement houses, museums, Native American reservations, schools, libraries. We are committed to taking the cachet of this great prize and bringing it to a much broader public and becoming known not only for literary distinction, but for pluralism. We want to show that these great works in our tradition can be accessible to a very, very broad audience. I think that, I'm thinking a lot about the relationship of the subjects for my biographies and my job, shall we say. And I think the point is that the American story is a very big story and a very varied story. And since my first roots are in literature, I feel very, very deeply committed to bringing great quality writing to a larger audience and making it the province of more people. Even though the publishing industry is, fundamentally an East Coast phenomenon, and the corporate structures are in the East Coast, but the public is very wide and very broadly based, and I think we have a responsibility to them.
How long have you run the foundation?
Let's see. The National Book Foundation was created about 5.5 years ago by the Board of Trustees of the then National Book Award, and I was brought on to put a programmatic shell around the conferring of the awards. And at the time, you may recall, literacy, the whole literacy struggle was really coming to the forefront with Mrs. Bush being a great spokeswoman for that. And the board felt that there had to be a way to construct a social mission, a socially responsible mission for the awards, so that they were not simply the province of the few, but that they belong to the many. That if we're going to be a cultural player, if the foundation's going to be a cultural player and a cultural participant, then we have to spread the word. We have to proselytize.
How long has the National Book Award been around?
See, the National Book Award's been around since 1950.
And who won it last year, the nonfiction?
Well, that would be Dr. Sherwin Newland, who wrote the book How We Die. He was the nonfiction winner.
Over the last couple of years, can you name others?
Well, of course, Annie Proulx was the fiction winner for The Shipping News.
What about nonfiction?
And, Paul Monette, who recently passed away, wrote a book called Becoming a Man. He was a nonfiction winner. And Orlando Patterson, who was a professor at Harvard, wrote a book called Freedom, and he was a very distinguished winner. I mean, the thing is that every year the judges change, and so you have a whole new constituency, a whole new critical opinion.
Where does the foundation get its money?
Well, the National Book Foundation is a non-profit 501c3 organization, and we are supported to a tremendous degree by the publishing industry, not only in New York City, but all around the country, because all the publishers that submit to us now, including, I should say, more than a third of all the members of the American Association of University Presses, which is a tremendous, growing sector of the publishing world, the small poetry presses as well as the big corporations in New York. Plus, we have wonderful funding from private foundations, the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, and Over the Month Club, and concerned individuals.
Quick things. Where were you born?
Where was I born? I was born in New York City, Manhattan.
In Manhattan?
Yeah.
You're married? How many children?
2.
How old?
A boy and a girl, 15. My son is 15. His name's Nicholas, and my daughter is Allegra. She's 13.
Where did you go to college?
I went to the University of Rochester, upstate New York, and then I did my graduate work in poetry at SUNY Buffalo.
And what did you do before you got into the foundation?
Well, I basically spent the last 2 decades in the nonprofit sector raising money for literature. I was at the New York Public Library on 42nd Street for 5 years, working with Vartan Gregorian on the campaign for the library to rehabilitate that entire institution, and I was running the annual fund there, raising money for operations.
Back to the book.
Certainly.
When did Thomas Edison start to lose his hearing?
See, this is a story that I thought, this is a chance to set the record straight, because here you have a person who was essentially, I believe, suffered first from variable hearing loss as a child. And I think a lot of parents who have young children can understand this. I mean, ear infections and hearing loss are very common among little kids starting on, just after they're born. And you have to remember this is a long, long time ago, before penicillin and before the kinds of sophisticated treatments we have now. So as a little boy, Edison was chastised by his teachers for not listening in class, daydreaming. And he really couldn't hear. It wasn't that he wasn't listening, it was that he couldn't hear. But the teachers chastised him in front of the class, and when he was 7 years old, after only 3 months of schooling, his mother came in and yanked him out of there. He never went back to school again. He was homeschooled for quite a long time, and then he became, again, as a consequence of his progressively degenerating hearing, he became a very introspective child. He became a voracious reader. He became literally an autodidact, who, as an adult, had a standing order at Brentano's bookstore for every single new book that came in, was shipped directly to his home. So, first you find the chronic ear infections, you find the hearing loss. That became, as I found doing my research, he developed an arthritic condition of the inner ear. In other words, the three bones that, as we call them, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, which are the 3 little bones that vibrate and touch each other, those 3 bones fused together at a certain point, probably in his 40s and 50s, because I've seen the records of his visits to a doctor on that, was the way they described it. He also had several abscess problems, which had to be lanced, which were behind his right ear especially, and you see him a lot of times in the photographs, you see him cupping this hand. So a variety of ear problems afflicted Thomas Edison, yet I would say he became totally deaf toward the very end, which ironically or paradoxically is when he entered the record business and started auditioning opera singers and instrumentalists, and in those instances he would either put his entire head inside the megaphone of the phonograph, stick it all the way in there, turn the volume all the way up, or in 1 or 2 instances, when a pianist was auditioning, he would literally clench his teeth around the frame of the piano, and the vibrations would come through his jawbone, and he would sense the music in that way. And I've seen the teeth marks on the side of the piano in Thomas Edison's home. But he signed off on every single recording that was made for his record company, even as his hearing was practically nil.
First wife died when and why? What was the disease?
Well, I think that, and again, I don't like to speculate in any of my books. I can definitely say that Mary Stilwell was a very lonely woman. She was depressed. The few letters of hers that survive talk about herself being alone, that Edison isn't here, my husband is not here, I have terrible headaches. She would say, my head is splitting. She became a drinker. We know this from the bills that she saved for her accounts with the liquor store. She was a big sherry drinker, and she gained a tremendous amount of weight toward the end. She became a compulsive eater also, and some of the pictures of her toward the end, and again, we're talking about a woman in her 20s, when you compare them to her wedding picture, which is in the book, you almost can't recognize them. And she was a neglected woman with 3 little kids and a husband who wasn't around. And as to the actual physical reason, cause for her death, I don't really know that, but she died very young and very sadly and alone.
Who was his second wife?
The second wife, our story changes 180 degrees, because you have to put this in the relationship in the context of a man who has achieved a certain level and a certain lifestyle and still quite young and still has 3 little children to take care of. Edison was one of these people, I think, who had to be taken care of by a woman, and I don't think he would have admitted that in so many words, but there's no question in my mind. He met Mina Miller, who was a young woman who he met through family friends in Boston, when Edison was recently widowed, and he was associating with some of his bachelor friends, and they were trying to connect him with eligible young women, and he met this young woman, Mina Miller, who was from Akron, Ohio. Now, the interesting thing about her is that her father was Lewis Miller, the inventor of the Reaper, a variety of the Reaper, sort of in the same generation as the McCormick Reaper. He was a very successful businessman who raised a large family in Akron, lived in a big house, sent his children to the best schools, and Mina was very self-possessed, very talented, very beautiful young woman. She was only 19 when he met her, but she was much more educated and I believe much more self-possessed than his first wife. And
what was the difference in Mr. Edison's age and his second wife's age?
Let's see, he would have been, they were married in 1885, so he was in his 40s. She was about 20. He was about twice her age.
And they had how many children?
They had 3 children, Madeline, Charles, and Theodore, the man I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the person that I met.
You say that when he died, Thomas Edison died, he had an estate of $12 million.
Indeed.
And that was in the 1930s. What would that have been like today?
Oh, my heavens. The thing that is interesting about that, the estate of Thomas Edison, is that there was the way the estate was disposed in the will is really a very instructive metaphor for his relationship to his children. What interested me about the estate were the conditions of the will, insofar as the fact that the 2 sons from the second marriage, Charles and Theodore, were the major beneficiaries, and the 3 children from the first marriage and the daughter from the second marriage were sort of given second-class citizenship in the terms of that will. You see, the relationship that Edison had with his first wife, of course, conditioned the problematic relationship, especially with the children from the first marriage, and it really conditioned a lot of the problems that they had growing up, a lot of the problems they had relating to him as a father, and that's something he never outgrew.
At the height of his success, who were his best friends?
Well, this whole subject of Edison's friendships is instructive, too, because here you have a person who has become known in a kind of exclusive way for the pantheon of material goods that we, again, mentioned earlier on. And yet, when you start to look at the structure of Edison's work, you find out that the other root of his genius was his ability to hire the best people who stayed with him for decades. Charles Batchelor, John Cruzy, William Kennedy Dixon, Jonas Aylesworth, Francis Upton. These are people that I would bet that those names don't ring true with too many people watching this program right now, whereas Thomas Edison has become a household name. But the thing is that these employees had expertise in electricity, physics, chemistry, and so forth and so on. And these were the people who were behind the scenes making the tremendous research and development contributions to Edison's corpus of work. And what happened was, when the time came to file the patent, their name was put subsidiary to Edison's. The patent was filed under Edison's auspices. They were given, in most cases, taken off salary and given a percentage of the gross revenues for these inventions in perpetuity. So the trade-off for these people was anonymity in the history books until recently, until now, until the whole sort of Edison scholarship that's grown up around him in the last decade or so. But college, education for their children, a house, and a secure income. You see, so when you ask about his friendships, these were very tight colleague relationships that were predicated upon involvement in these great inventions.
What was his relationship to Harvey Firestone, Henry Ford, John Burroughs, R.J. H. DeLoach?
Yes,
there's a picture that you have.
Later on, of course, in the 1890s, 1896, I believe, was when Edison met Henry Ford. And that's a different genre of friendship, because that has to do with an older man, by that time, Edison being a revered icon in the mind of Henry Ford, who at that time was working for the Detroit Edison Company. He was actually an employee of Edison's by extension at a certain period. And Henry Ford was just beginning to become involved in the internal combustion engine. And he went to a convention of Edison managers in Long Island, at which Edison gave a speech. And someone brought Ford over to Edison's table and said, here's a young man who's beginning to work on the internal combustion engine. And he sat down next to Edison and sketched on a napkin this design for the stroke engine he was working on. And Edison pounded his hand on the table and said, you've got a good idea, keep at it, and one day, you'll become a success. There's a certain apocryphal strain to that, but the fact is that Henry Ford was Thomas Edison's greatest admirer and most long-standing admirer for all time. And at times when Edison was having problems financially with his cash flow, Ford would would commission him, for instance, to design a battery for the Model T, and he gave him a loan of $200,000 or $300,000 to get him through and help support Edison at the end of his life when he was doing his research in the rubber plant. And just peripherally, as far as Burroughs and Firestone were concerned, there was a whole series of camping trips that these men went on during the teens and 20s when they would take a caravan of cars and go out into the mountains and sit around the fire and talk about the great issues of the day, and of course always wearing their white shirts and ties, but it wasn't exactly roughing it, but there was a sort of a male bonding that went on there for a while between these captains of industry.
You said that Thomas Edison was a populist?
I didn't use that word lightly. I think that if you look at some of the statements he made about his the rationale behind some of his inventions, you will find statements sort of akin to Henry Ford's, "I will build a car for the great multitudes." In the same way you have Edison, for instance. I don't know how familiar people are with Edison's work with prefabricated housing for working people. Edison was convinced that he could design a concrete house that would be poured into a mold in one day. The entire house would be poured into a cast iron mold from the top, and he had a concept that he would build huge housing developments very cheaply for, as he called it, the working man, to allow him to provide the sort of American dream, the American ideal of the home, the freestanding home for his family. And when he was producing the phonograph records, his main goal was to promote music that was palatable to the masses and that conformed to his taste. His taste in literature ran to poets such as Longfellow, who was his all-time favorite. I mean, he had a very mainstream sensibility, and he believed he was in a position to disseminate that through his Thomas Edison Industries. So that's why I say populist.
This is a real leap.
Oh, like Trevor Phillips Industries.
When we took a tour of the Ross Perot little museum outside his office a couple years ago during the political campaign, one of his proud moments was to stop and point to a letter that was written by Thomas Edison and signed on the wall. Why would that be that valuable today?
You mean why does it seem that Ross Perot would value the letter?
No, I mean, obviously it was an expensive item, I suspect. I mean, it's how much he paid.
Because I think that I know I read an op-ed piece about Ross Perot, and it referred to his reverence for Thomas Edison from an entrepreneurial standpoint, which I think is very easy to understand. That there's a certain sense of identity there with the sensibility of Thomas Edison.
How would Thomas Edison's inventions do today in the governmental regulation we have here in this day?
Well, there was a very apt analogy. During the First World War, Edison was contracted briefly with the Department of the Navy to develop new technologies to help with submarine warfare. And he came to Washington and lived here for about a year, working for the Naval Consulting Board, as it was called at the time. And he developed a roster of 3 or 4 dozen different inventions, mostly having to do with ways of tracking submarines and sending up flares and signaling other boats. And he advocated, a certain type of naval commerce that would avoid danger and so forth and so on. Unfortunately, none of these ideas was adapted by the Navy, and Edison went away feeling very much disillusioned by the bureaucracy at the time. But he really wanted to support his country. He was a real patriot.
This picture.
The nap. Well, the naps were important to Edison. The cat naps, that was taken in his lab at West Orange. I think that some of the stories that we've all grown up with about Edison not needing any sleep really bear looking at. I think a more accurate way of describing it would be that he could survive on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. That's true, because his pattern was such that he'd like to stay up late after everyone else went to sleep, be upstairs in his study. And at that time he had what was called a thought bench up there, which was a place where he would sit when he was totally quiet, totally isolated, so that he could reflect and really distill his thinking and sort out what he was going to do the next day and plan his whole next day while the whole rest of the family was asleep. But during the day, as an older man, he would get tired and he would have to take these cat naps, and he was known for being able to fall asleep in the most inhospitable circumstances. He could literally sleep anywhere, and then he would wake up refreshed after 5 or 6 minutes.
Did you get to know him, you think, well enough that you could describe what he would like to spend a couple of hours with?
I think I could. As a matter of fact, of the 3 subjects I've written about, I think that Edison would have been the one that I personally could have connected with the best. I think because of his many times stated appreciation of the combination of imaginative thinking and hard work. And someone asked me the other day, where does the genius reside? Does it reside in the imagination, or does it reside in the hard work? And I said I think it's a synthesis of both. That it's not a eureka kind of thing. It's not a flash. It's the understanding that the tributaries of hard work feed into and out of the creative mind, and you cannot just expect to have ideas spring fully formed out of your mind from beginning to end. They require a consciously directed effort. And I think that I believe there would have been an intuitive understanding of that dynamic in a human being. I think that I could have communicated with Edison on that level.
What did he end up dying of?
Oh, well, he ended up dying of pretty much just system breakdown, you might say. He had congestion of the lungs. He had very serious digestive problems as an older person. As a matter of fact, the last couple of years of his life, he was on an all-milk diet, which, of course, from a medical standpoint, I don't know what the rationale would be, except that he was very, very sensitive to many foods, and he couldn't eat a lot of things, and he lost a lot of weight, and became very weak. It wasn't a question of his heart giving out or his brain giving out. Pretty much his respiratory system and his digestive system combined.
How did you get interested in biography?
It has a different name than that.
Well, I think I'm a student of the human condition. I've always been interested in other words, I think my interest in biography is built upon my interest in people in general and in understanding what motivates people. Just people that I know, people that I've known throughout my whole life. I think really biography, the craft of biography, is a sleuthing job that requires you to, like a detective, you have to build all the evidence as we're seeing nowadays. You have to build and collect all the evidence. I always like to get all my research together in one place before I start writing. I like to have my entire case, as it were, laid out for me from beginning to end before I start to actually work on the book.
Where do you write the book?
In my study on the third floor of my house, in a little room under the eaves there with a computer. I mean, it's not very romanticized, but it's on the third floor, so the rest of the family activities take place on the first and second floors, and I have to be somewhat isolated to do the work, but I mean, the field work and the collection of the data is the social part that I also enjoy.
How many places did you go? For instance, did you go to the little home in Milan, Ohio?
Oh, yes. I would like to. I'm proud of the fact that I went to every single place that Edison lived in this country. That is to say, Milan, Ohio, Port Huron, Michigan, Boston, New York, Newark, Menlo Park, West Orange, and then I went to Florida, where he had his major winter estate, which is in Fort Myers on the Caloosahatchee River in Florida. He has a beautiful home there, which of course he designed himself and landscaped himself. I also went to England because I did research at the Institution for Electrical Engineers over there, and they have a whole archive from the time when Thomas Edison electrified a 10 square block section of the city of London, which he did before New York. So there's a whole sort of subtext of Thomas Edison's residence over there in London and his electrification of the center city of London, the Holborn Viaduct area.
Has his tradition been captured at all these places? Are there plaques? Are there homes? Are there tours?
They vary in complexity and in degree of elaboration. I mean, the West Orange factory complex, which is just across from New York, is a 19th century kind of Gothic structure with tours and a shop and docents and so forth. And then his estate, Glenmont, is in Llewellyn Park, is up the hill from the factory, so you get a very good sense of his relationship of his home life to his working life. The Fort Myers site is a very popular tourist attraction because it's so picturesque.
What keeps it all going?
Well, that again is very different in all the different places. The Fort Myers site is owned by the city of Fort Myers, whereas the West Orange factory was given to the National Park Service. So it's part of the same system that runs Yosemite, and it's part of the same system that runs the outdoor parks that we are more familiar with, but it's run by the Park Service. The Milan Little House is run by the Historical Society there, the Edison Home Society. In Port Huron, they're doing a very interesting excavation, an actual archaeological excavation of the site where Edison grew up. So you can stand on the hillside overlooking the river where Edison stood. You can see the little train depot where he worked as a child, and it's right on the river there.
What influence did Thomas Paine have on his life?
Well, Edison, evidently as a young man, read the works of Paine, which were on the bookshelf in his home. In 1925, he actually wrote a preface for a volume of Paine's writings, and he felt a very strong identification with Paine's ideology. We talked about populism earlier. I think Edison felt that Paine was an exemplar of American values, especially of freedom of the individual, the autonomy of the individual, which I think was a major premise of Edison's.
Books. You obviously spend a lot of time around books. You've written 3 yourself, and you're responsible for getting that National Book Award announced every year. What time of year is it announced?
November, right the week before Thanksgiving is when we have our big announcement of the winners. And the nominees, the finalists, are announced in early October, about 6 weeks before the major event. We have a dinner at the Plaza, which is sort of like the Oscars, and all the nominees come, and we make a big hoopla about that, and that's when they're announced.
What do they get, the winners?
The winners? Well, each winner gets $10,000 and a bronze statue by Joel Shapiro, who actually is the sculptor who did the statue at the Holocaust Museum here. Joel Shapiro is the artist who did that statue, and he was commissioned by the foundation to do a sort of a bronze award that goes to each winner, and the finalists each get $1,000.
They're known as.
Are you precluded from entering the award?
The Board of Trustees, actually, just a few weeks ago, the Board of Trustees of the National Book Foundation decided that obviously anyone who's winning the National Book Awards can't be an entrant in the National Book Awards.
How many people on your board?
We have 15 trustees. It's about half CEOs of publishing companies, because the publishing industry has always had a strong representation. And then we have other authors and, as I say, philanthropic private citizens.
Is there any point in the process of choosing the book winners of the year where you throw your hands up and say, there's too much politics in this?
I really think that the National Book Award, because of the way we set up the process, unlike some other awards, I think the National Book Award has maintained its democratic structure. We have different judges every year that are an autonomous panel that make their own deliberations and come to their own conclusions. The publishers are only the publishers are allowed to submit the titles, and they're not allowed to submit them with any accompanying material of any kind, and they're not allowed to communicate directly with the judges at all, at any time.
Because this show is devoted to nonfiction, hardback books, what's the future of that industry? How's it doing?
Which
nonfiction books?
Well, I think the future of quality American literature is very good, because I think publishers are beginning to understand that the reading public is capable of reaching for higher standards. And I think you have to look. I think you have to look beyond the bestseller list. And I've been going into bookstores for a long, long time, and I think that the independent bookstores and the chains together are presenting more titles by more authors that are causing the reading public to reach a little bit more, to stretch a little bit more, and they can stretch, and they will.
Any idea how many books are sold a year? And is it going up?
Well, I can tell you this. About 45 to 50,000 different titles are published in this country every single year. Different titles every single year. But the book industry is about $1 billion industry now. So somebody's got to be spending
going up or down?
It's going up. It's going up. Consumerism of books is definitely going up.
How many biographies of Edison have been written?
Well, one of the first things I did before starting this book was I read every single word that had ever been written about Thomas Edison, and it went in phases. There was a big burst of stuff right about the time that he reached middle age and he was becoming famous, and there was another burst in the 1920s when he was becoming revered as a deity almost in American culture. But in the last 35 years, which is what I was sort of focusing on, there have only been 2 biographies that are of any note, which I talk about as having some strengths and some weaknesses, but I think mine is the most balanced and the one that deals the most with him as a human being, as a person, as well as a myth.
Our guest, Neil Baldwin, the book Edison, Inventing the Century, and we thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
For a transcript of this Book Notes program, please send $5 to C-SPAN Transcripts in care of Typewriter Incorporated. Post Office Box 885, Lincolnshire, Illinois. The zip code is 60069. Here's a Book Notes calendar for the next few weeks. On March 26th, our guest is Work is now underway on the second C-SPAN school bus. Scheduled to hit the road in 1996, the new bus will join the current C-SPAN school bus, traveling the nation, educating you about the political network of record.
Right now, we're inside Thomas Edison's Menlo Park Laboratory here in Dearborn, Michigan. Thomas Edison probably was one of the world's greatest inventors. Well, Henry Ford moved it here between 1927 and 1929. The grounds that they found, when they went back to Menlo Park, for the most part, all they found were the houses falling apart, and most of the buildings were stripped of their wood and their bricks by farmers who took it after Edison left Menlo Park to go to New York to start the Pearl Street Station in 1885. When Henry Ford and Edison came back, for the most part, they just found the foundations. So Henry Ford put out a call and said, if you took anything from the site during the 50 years that have passed, I will buy all the wood back and all the bricks. So most of the wood is from the Menlo Park complex, and the rest was added. Henry Ford went so far as to bring the original topsoil from Menlo Park, New Jersey, and dump it on the grounds that we're standing on right now. One of the more interesting stories that we have here in the laboratory is that of the chair that we have nailed to the floor here. This chair, which you'll see right when you walk up the stairs, is the chair that Edison sat in. October 21st, 1929, he reenacted the lighting of the light bulb here in Greenfield Village. Henry Ford spent $10 million to build the complex between 1927 and 1929, and on October 21st, 1929, for the 50th anniversary of the lighting of the light bulb, he invited Edison from his Luella Park, New Jersey home to come to the village and reenact the lighting. They had a big dinner party in his honor inside the museum. 500 people show up. Some of them are Herbert Hoover, John D. Rockefeller, Orville Wright, Charles Lindbergh, Madame Curie, Will Rogers, Harvey Firestone. Anyone who was anyone in America and Europe was here for this event. After dinner, Edison, Ford, Hoover, and an announcer from CBS Radio come out to the restored laboratory. Edison sits down in the chair, begins the reenactment, and once he lights the light bulb, he triggers a switch and lights up the entire village and museum at the same time. And that night, Henry Ford ordered his janitors to nail the chair to the floor as a lasting tribute memorial to Edison's genius. It's been nailed there ever since.
Today, the C-SPAN school bus is in Nebraska, where the crew meets with high school students in Omaha and tours the William Jennings Bryan home in Lincoln.
TV on C-SPAN 2 starting September 12th. All books, all weekend, every weekend.
American Perspectives continues now with Robert Rosenberg, director of the Thomas Edison Papers. He talked about the influence the inventor had on society. This event was hosted by the Chautauqua Institution Women's Club and lasted about an hour.
The Women's Club welcomes your membership. $10 a season goes to support the programs that we have, especially the scholarships that we give to music students and dance and drama students here at Chautauqua. So we do have a membership table over there. The Chautauqua Women's Club and Chautauqua Institution warmly welcome C-SPAN and its many viewers today. Chautauqua is a 9-week center for the arts, education, religion, and recreation in western New York State. Eventually, everyone at Chautauqua learns that Thomas Edison married Mina Miller, the daughter of Lewis Miller, one of Chautauqua's founders, for whom the Miller Bell Tower, Miller Park, and Miller Avenue are named. Our speaker today, Robert Rosenberg, knows a whole lot more than most of us about the romance and marriage of Mina Miller and Thomas Edison. Dr. Rosenberg is an endless source of information about Edison, his personal life, but more importantly, his life of constant scientific investigating, designing, tinkering, and manufacturing. Robert Rosenberg is director of the Thomas A. Edison Papers at Rutgers University, a project dedicated to the publication of Thomas Edison's documentary legacy. He began working as a historical editor with the project in 1983. From 1987 to 95, he was managing editor of the book edition, overseeing the production of the project's first 3 volumes. In 1995, he became director of the Thomas Edison Papers project. To date, the Edison Papers has published 162 reels of microfilm, covering the 48 years from 1850 to 1898, and 3 volumes of transcribed, annotated documents, covering the 30 years from 1847 to 1877. The next collection of microfilm, to be published in 1999, will span the 11 years between 1899 and 1910. The 4th volume is at the press, and the 5th is in progress. I offer you a glimpse of the vastness of the Edison documentation. Today, Dr. Rosenberg illuminates the human and practical importance of one man's work. Here to answer the question, what if there had been no Thomas A. Edison, Dr. Robert Rosenberg.
Thank you very much. I understand that I have you as a captive audience until it stops raining. So I was told to recite a story about Lee Trevino recently on the golf course with some of his friends, and a storm like this hit, and everybody ran for the clubhouse except Trevino, who picked up a 1-iron and held it in the middle of the fairway. And when his friends came out afterwards, he said, "What were you doing out there?" He said, "Come on, not even God can hit a 1-iron." So I am here to talk about this large historical deep thought about what if there had been no Edison. But since I am at Chautauqua, I'll give a little glimpse of the good stuff about his meeting and courtship of Mina Miller, because it's not uninteresting, just as a human story. Edison was actually invited by John Vincent, who with Miller was one of the founders of Chautauqua, to come here in 1878 to talk about electricity. Edison really didn't like public speaking. He left that to his historians much later. But he went out west instead and went on a vacation. Some years later, in 1885, after the death of his first wife, he was in New Orleans with a friend, and they went to the World Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition. I'm not sure what it was the centennial of. And there, Miller's firm, which exhibited agricultural material, agricultural machinery, had a large exhibit. And Edison met the 19-year-old Mina Miller there, just briefly. Later that summer, he met her again up at this friend's house in Boston. He was quite taken with her, and referred to her as a handsome brunette with great dazzling eyes, and soon was using her as a yardstick for measuring perfection. So he was rather taken with her. He came here in the summer of 1885 later for 4 days. It turned into a week, and invited Mina to accompany him and a large party of people on a trip to the St. Lawrence River and the White Mountains. Now, at that point, Mina was not quite engaged, but expected to marry George Vincent, the son of the Vincent family. Didn't quite work that way. She found this other fellow who was, at the time, 38, a little more interesting. And they went on the trip, and it's a testament to her intelligence. He taught her Morse code well enough so that they could communicate by tapping on each other's knees in the carriage. He was pretty deaf at that point. And so they would carry on long conversations as they rolled through the White Mountains, calling each other all kinds of little pet names without embarrassment, as he said. And finally, he screwed his courage to the sticking place and proposed, and she said yes, and he was delighted. He came out here in September. He came rather to Akron, Ohio, to see Lewis Miller at his home, and Lewis Miller approved, and they were married the next year in February. He came here after that, not as often as Mina would have liked. He was often busy, but Mina would come back with the children from his first marriage, and then the 3 from their own. He took her back, and just as an end to the good stuff, I'll tell you that they moved into a house called Glenmont in New Jersey, a beautiful place. It's now part of the National Park Service's Edison National Historic Site, and 23-room house, really lovely mansion that Edison got for a song because it had been taken away from the fellow who built it with money he'd embezzled from Arnold Constable. So, there's a lot of good stuff. You just have to look for it. It's everywhere. The Edison papers, as described, that was pretty concise and pretty clear. We have about 5 million pieces of paper that Edison left behind when he died. A lot of that is business, and a lot of it is interesting. Some of it is routine, some of it is really fascinating. I have been working with him for about 15 years now, not as long as, in fact, one of my colleagues, who's just finished a biography that will be out this fall, in which I encourage you to look for if you're interested in Edison. It's being published by John Wiley, and I think is going to be wonderful. It's been very hard to do a biography of Edison because there's so much paper about him, there's so much to know, and he was such a very busy boy. I feel like after this time I know him fairly well, maybe a little too well. But apropos of today's subject, I wanted to open with 2 quotes, one by a historian of technology who is famous to other historians of technology, a man named Mel Cransford, who said that without Edison we'd all be watching television by candlelight. And just as a thought. And the other by Niels Bohr, the physicist, who said prediction is very hard, particularly of the future. And that's also true. And to open this, I wanted to use this image from chaos theory, which got a lot of press some years ago. This idea that tiny disturbances can have very large effects down the road. There's an image that's used a lot of a butterfly in China flapping its wings, and sometime later, as a result, there are thunderstorms in, let's say, Chautauqua. And the idea is just that things spread, and there are ripples and ramifications. It's also true that if all the butterflies in China got together and flapped their wings, it wouldn't change fundamentally the weather here in Chautauqua. It would still be hot in the summer with thunderstorms and cold in the winter with snow. Well, El Nino, as we know, is bigger than a butterfly. In history, there are analogous questions. Are individuals important, or is there a grand sweep that really just rides over everything? Or does it depend on the circumstance and the people and what it is we're talking about? There was a recent article in a magazine called Military History Quarterly, in which the author looked at, I think, 7 or a dozen important battles. And he made the argument that these battles absolutely affected what happened afterwards in the largest way, going back to the Greeks' defeat of the Persians at Salamis in 490 BC, which was a decisive naval battle. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of contention in the letters as people argue about whether they mattered or not, whether there were other overriding concerns that mattered. James Burke had a television series called Connections that many of you may have seen, in which he followed little effects as they bounced through history, and if it was a little exaggerated sometimes, the point was that contingency was really important. Little things make a tremendous difference. Would the second half of the 20th century have been different if this fellow von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators had managed to kill Hitler? Undoubtedly. But quite apart from the World War II ending earlier and the Cold War being different and the Marshall Plan being different, millions of people would have lived, and playing out their lives would have made unimaginable differences. So, and we can go back farther and wonder if some group of thugs had murdered this guy Saul of Tarsus near Damascus, or if Napoleon or Newton had died young, what would have happened? And so we can ask, well, what would have happened if Edison had never invented anything? I could launch into an answer to that, but it probably makes more sense first to talk a little bit about what he did, since I've learned painfully that I can't assume that everybody knows everything about Thomas Edison. As I think back 15 years, I recall that I didn't know anything much about Edison. He was born in 1847, and last year was the 150th, the sesquicentennial of his birth. His father, Samuel Edison, was a political firebrand who had to leave Canada, having participated in a rebellion that didn't quite become a revolution, and who was under a sentence of death if he came back to treason. His mother, Nancy, had been a teacher of some sort, probably or possibly a Sunday school teacher. Edison was the baby of 6 children. The 2 next oldest children died when he was quite young, and soon his oldest sister, Tanny, was married, leaving him, the baby, at home with his mother, who had been a teacher, and his father, who was very well read and held a library around the Midwest with him. Milan, Ohio is just south of the Lake Erie, and it was a very important canal town that in the early 1850s suddenly turned into a backwater when they built the railroad and didn't go through Milan, as happens sometimes. At that point, the family moved to a place called Port Huron, which is down at the southern end of Lake Huron, northeast of Detroit. Edison was educated at home by his parents, as you can imagine. Mom, who's educated, has this kid, her baby, why send him off? She can teach him reading, writing, the other things. There were a few things she couldn't teach him. She couldn't teach him science, and he did go to school for some 3 months when he was about 12 to study science at a school up there, and he'd been to school once before. But you can imagine he was probably pretty bored as a student, being a lively fellow. He certainly was, although there have been legends about him being addled or a poor student, he was a voracious reader his entire life and had nothing that anyone could recognize as any kind of disability in learning almost anything. In his early teens, he was what's called a candy butcher on the train. He sold candy and magazines and dime novels and other things on a train that ran between Port Huron and Detroit, about a 60-mile run. He'd make that once a day down and back. He spent his time in the Detroit Public Library. He read his own books. He studied telegraphy, which was the computerese of the day. He began to go deaf, probably from scarlet fever when he was around 10 or 11, some kind of disease. There were some real Horatio Alger stories in his life. When he was a candy butcher at age 12, 13, 14, passing through and stopping in a place called Mount Clemens on the way, he rescued the 2-year-old son of Station Master James Mackenzie from the path of either a rolling boxcar or a very slow-moving train. The father was understandably grateful and taught him railroad telegraphy, which was a special kind of telegraphy that the railroads used, a special set of signals. So Edison had a leg up there. James Mackenzie remained his friend for life and shows up in photographs years later in Menlo Park in New Jersey. As a telegrapher, which he became for his teen years, he hung out with journalists, with local politicians, and just sat up with them at night listening while they drank whiskey and ate crackers and talked politics. And Edison was never much of a drinker. He didn't have much of a taste for it. I did not agree with him, which I suppose helped him get in time to do other things. He had to learn to write very fast and very clearly. He was a press wire operator. He was never a really great sender, but he was terrific at receiving. He could write very fast and very clearly. And as you can imagine, if you're on a local newspaper and you want copy to come in, the AP had been founded in 1848, I believe, and Edison was getting press wire copy. He would come in and he'd write it down, and the copies would have to go out straight to the newspaper. He had to make as many as 8 copies at once, writing with an agate stylus and oiled paper to make copies. It was cumbersome, but it worked. Later, when he toured the middle of the country as a telegraph operator, going to Louisville and Cincinnati, and Memphis, and a lot of other places, which was a common thing for young men who were interested in telegraphy to do. There was a kind of fraternity of itinerant telegraphers, probably like programmers in Silicon Valley. Now they all know each other and they just go company to company. He compiled lists of books that he bought, things like Michael Faraday's Researches in Electricity. Faraday was a great hero of Edison's, was considered the greatest experimental scientist, at least in the English-speaking world, in the 19th century. And when Edison finally bought it, he wasn't shy. He wrote things in the margin, like something wrong about that experiment. I must try this, do it right, that kind of thing. He built a library when he got to Menlo Park. He built a bigger library in the 1880s at West Orange. If you've ever been there and seen it, it's beautiful. If you haven't seen it, it's beautiful, and I recommend it. It's a 3-story inside open room with a balcony and carved wood. He filled it with journals and reference books and other kinds of books. In 1868, at the age of 20-21, Edison moved to Boston, which was the end of his itinerant years, and he went to work for Western Union there. He'd been working around the country for Western Union. Another Horatio Alger story, he walks into the office having been stuck in the snow up in Montreal for 3 days. He comes in, his hat's down around his ears, he's got a dirty white shirt on, he looks like a hick, he sounds like a hick, and everybody in Boston looks at him and thinks he's a hick. So they put him on the fastest wire they've got, a lightning slinger from New York, who starts sending and sending and sending, and Edison sits and puts his foot up. He knows what's going on. He's probably done it himself to other people. And he starts receiving and writing, and the guy's sending faster and faster and faster, and then he starts abbreviating words, and then he starts leaving words out. And finally Edison breaks in and he says, come on, he said, why don't you start sending with the other foot? At which point, everybody thinks, this Edison, he's a great guy, and he was apparently quite a personable fellow. People liked him for his stories. Lewis Miller and Edison were terrifically fond of each other. Besides being related by marriage, they really enjoyed each other's company, respected each other a lot. When he got to New York the next year in 1869, he had a job, not really a job, he was hanging out in the Wall Street area at the various offices, one particular one that was reporting stock information. The stock ticker had been invented a couple of years before, and Edison was working on various tickers himself, and he was in this office when the main transmitter went down. Well, Edison had studied it, and he was a pretty quick study. He knew what happened. He fixed it. Well, everybody was running around, and the owner of the company, a fellow named Samuel Laws, was so excited he gave him a job, as you can understand. He went on from there to work his way into the community of stockbrokers, of telegraphers, and telegraph company officers in New York City. His first shop he set up the next year in Newark, 1870. He was 23 years old. He was married in 1871, his first wife, moved to Menlo Park and set up a laboratory in 1876, which is very bold. It's the middle of a depression, and it started in 1873, and he said, I'm moving out there and set up a laboratory and just invent things. And he succeeded. He moved back to New York around 1881 to work on electric lighting. His first wife died in 1884, leaving him with 3 children. He remarried Mina Miller in 1886 in February, moved to Glenmont in West Orange, set up his big West Orange laboratory that still stands in 1887, incorporated this large number of companies into something called Thomas A. Edison Incorporated in 1911, and then he died in 1931 at the age of 84, having amassed 1,093 United States patents, which nobody has touched yet, and which is really just one measure of his productivity. Now that's his life, as it happened, in a can. Here's an actual news clipping. I'm going to read you a news clipping from the Louisville, Kentucky Daily Journal from the 2nd of August, 1866. Edison is 19 years old. for South America, it said. It actually said E.A. Edison, but his name was T.A. Edison. T.A. Edison and J.C. Curran, formerly of the Western Union Telegraph Company in this city, started yesterday for South America by way of Nashville and New Orleans. Their exact destination is not known, but they expect to join some one of the various telegraph corps in Brazil or Rio de Janeiro. Success to the young adventurers. The next day, the Daily Journal praised him as a telegrapher. He apparently had a very good reputation. After reporting a note from the New Albany, Indiana commercial, New Albany, Indiana is right across the river from Louisville, which was bidding farewell to one of their telegraphers who was coming across the river to replace Edison. And they said nice things about him. On the Monday, the 30th of July, 2 days before Edison had left, there was a bloody and very ugly race riot down in New Orleans. Now, that was a result that had causes that ranged from local demagoguery and politics to post-Civil War American Reconstruction. There were all kinds of things that fed into it. When Edison got there in New Orleans with his two friends, picked up someone on the way, they found that the ship to Brazil had been commandeered under martial law, and after hanging around for a few days, he decided to go back to Port Huron, to his parents' home. Then after that, he went back to Louisville, resumed his career, and went on to become the signature inventor of the modern era. He heard at some point that his two fellow adventurers had died of yellow fever in Veracruz, Mexico. Now, it doesn't take much to put Edison on that boat. If they left Louisville a week earlier, or if the convention that precipitated the riot in New Orleans had been held a week later, Edison could have died himself of yellow fever, or he might have opened a tavern called Little Al's down in Veracruz, where all the drinks were mixed and served by little robots. He was known as, because of the Alva, he was known as Al to people who knew him the first 20 years of his life. So we don't have Edison now, and the question is, what's different? What's changes in Western technology, Western culture? There's some odd little things that would have changed. For example, the University of Missouri would not have burned down in the middle of the 1890s if Edison hadn't lived, because the fire was started by some faulty wiring installed by a physics professor when he installed equipment that Edison had donated to the school. And Edison donated the school because the president, a guy named Samuel Laws, had been that self-same guy who gave him his first job. So who knows, the University of Missouri might have become even a greater school than it is. Without the availability and the prestige of Edison's cement, he started a Portland cement company later in his life. Yankee Stadium in New York might have been built of brick. And imagine what that could have done to the psyche of New Yorkers. It's unimaginable. I really don't know. A fellow named Joseph Rife poured $200,000 into one of Edison's early technologies that failed. And without that, maybe he would have done something wiser and started a great family fortune. Hard to know. William Kemmler would certainly not have been electrocuted at Sing Sing in 1890 with a Westinghouse dynamo. Almost people wanted to call it, Edison's people wanted to call it Westinghouseing, but Westinghouse's people didn't like that, you can imagine. Henry Ford would not have worked for the Detroit Edison Company and would not have met Thomas Edison as he says he did in 1896 when Edison encouraged him with his ideas about industrial production. We'd all be driving Citroens, those of us who aren't driving Volkswagens or Toyotas. Edison made his mark, the living Edison made his mark in telegraphy, electric light and power, sound recording, motion pictures, iron mining, cement preparation, storage batteries, and numerous other areas. How would they have been different if he hadn't lived? Well, how different was Edison himself from anyone else at the time, from the other great inventors? If the label genius means anything, then Edison was an inventive genius. His output was prodigious. In the year 1882, he applied successfully for 102 patents, which is about one every 3 days. We figure that he applied for about 50% more patents in the U.S. than he received, meaning somewhere 1,500 or 1,600 applications during his life, to say nothing of the hundreds, if not thousands, of foreign patents that he received that we frankly just can't keep track of. He tackled problems that other people were working on most of the time. He rarely developed anything new, but his tremendous energy and his ability to develop solutions led to achievements that were really unmatched. He did what everybody else was doing, but he did more of it, he did it faster, he did it more thoroughly. He was Leonardo, or he was Mozart to Salieri, or he was Picasso to Braque, or if you like modern things, he was Robin Williams or Michael Jordan. He was just that much better than other people that you've never heard of, all the other great 19th century inventors that historians of technology talk about and the general public don't know because they were overshadowed by Edison. The most important thing, and I'll hammer away at this during the talk, at Menlo Park and in the first decade at West Orange in the 1880s and 90s, he had unmatched human and material resources. He knew from the very beginning of his career as an inventor that he could accomplish far more if he assembled a team that included co-experimenters to work with him at the bench and machinists to make things when he needed them. Instead of having to wait, take something to a shop, wait for them to make it, get it back, he turned to his machinists. He said, I need 3 of these, and do it this way, this way, this way. And the machinists were all very good, and they might suggest changes. And Edison worked with them as he worked with his co-experimenters. He started building the team in the early 1870s, and when he moved to Menlo Park, he took a small but extremely talented group with him, and also a very, very sophisticated machine shop that he bought, a lot of it with that $200,000 from Josiah Rife and his friends. But that development, the invention of the Research and Development Laboratory, represents the American institutionalization of something that the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead called the greatest invention of the 19th century, which is the invention of the method of invention, which is to say institutionalizing this idea of research and development so that you're not dependent on individuals doing things. At the same time, his first grade laboratory in Menlo Park was not designed as a place for everyone to brainstorm and work out ideas. It was a place to work out his ideas. As he said later in Patent Interference, I am not in the habit of asking my assistants for ideas. I generally have all the ideas I want. The difficulty lies in judging which is the best idea to carry out. When Edison wasn't at the laboratory, things slowed down. One of his assistants, Francis Upton, said, one thing is quite noticeable here. The work is only a few days behind Mr. Edison, for when he is sick, the shop was shut evenings as the work was wanting to keep the men busy. If we look at the sweep of Edison's career, his direct impact waxes through the end of the 19th century and then wanes, it fades off into the early decades of the 20th. Although he made his reputation in the early and mid-1870s, principally improving various telegraphic technologies for which people were willing to pay a great deal of money and for which Western Union paid him well. He also invented things like the electric pen. And I can see everybody knows what an electric pen is. You may remember in the 1960s there was a big fuss about electric carving knives. And at that point some wag invented an electric fork that you plugged into the wall. It didn't do anything. But you could plug it in along with your electric knife. So you'd have two things plugged in and be very modern, you know. The electric pen was a little device. It was a very sharp stylus with an electric motor on the top that was slightly off-center in its general incarnation. And it vibrated. And as you wrote with it on a piece of waxed paper, you poked holes in the waxed paper and created a stencil. It was an office copying technology. At the time, the only available technology was a very messy chemical process. And Edison invented this. And it is, in a certain sense, the godfather of the mimeograph. But much more directly, it's the ancestor of the tattoo needle. And some of you, and I'm sure you know who you are, have seen tattoo needles. They are essentially an electric pen with a little ink reservoir attached that someone did and developed in 1891. They took Edison's electric pen, put some ink on it, and started pricking people's skin, which was much easier than doing it slowly by hand. He also worked on a typewriter in his early years a little bit. But the fact is those inventions didn't have the kind of direct effect his later work was. The later developments, even in telegraphy, to say nothing of office copying and the typewriter, didn't really depend on Edison's work. Beginning with his move to Menlo Park in 1876, though, and his work on the telephone, Edison became more and more important in the larger culture. It's not that he was getting smarter or more inventive. He said that his early telegraph work in developing something called the quadruplex that sent 4 messages to each way at the same time was the hardest thing he ever did. And it was wildly fecund. He invented all kinds of things. But what happened was with the physical and financial and human resources he had in Menlo Park, he could tackle bigger and bigger questions. He invented the well-funded research laboratory, and the ramifications of that color everything that happened afterwards. No one else could have accomplished what Edison did between 1876 and the turn of the century. In his absence, in the absence of his pioneering institution, history would have run a different and unpredictable course. Now, the telephone of Alexander Graham Bell, which was a marvel of the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, was profoundly transformed by Edison. As initially presented, it had a transmitter that was inadequate at any significant distance. Edison and his associates spent more than a year of intensive labor creating a superior transmitter for Western Union, hacking it, really, in the best hacker tradition of 110-hour weeks, seven days a week, incessant work. The transmitter they developed, with a principle entirely different from Bell's, was in use for about a century. And if any of you ever unscrewed the mouthpiece of a standard telephone from any earlier day and had this little round thing fall out, that was Edison's idea. That was his transmitter. It's been around until recently when the condenser microphone took over. It was terribly important. It's true that 2 other inventors, notably a fellow named David Hughes, an Englishman, and Emil Berliner, arrived at the same principle at nearly the same time. But there's no reason to suppose that they or anyone else could have done what Edison did, which is take that idea and turn it into a practical, usable commercial instrument, which was what took them most of the year. Edison's research laboratory gave him that opportunity. Without it, the telephone would have had difficulty in cities, picking up noisy, inductive interference from nearby lines, and in rural areas where the distances were too great for practical work. Now, perhaps a wholly different solution might have emerged, or perhaps the Bell Company would have been able to stifle competing developments, and the public would have been saddled for a decade or longer with an instrument that worked poorly. But worst of all, the worst thing would have been the effect on the English language, because Alexander Graham Bell wanted to use ahoy as a telephone greeting. Although hello was already in the language, it shows up in Tom Sawyer, which was written just about 1876. Edison introduced it as a greeting for the telephone. They used it in their laboratory. And the idea of picking up and saying ahoy, it's just wrong. Now, most people today associate Edison first and foremost with incandescent light. Without him, the light's development would have been considerably slower. But we still have some kind of electrical illumination to read the TV guide with, I'm sure. A number of other experimenters were working on an incandescent lamp in the 1870s and early 1880s, and sooner or later someone would have arrived at Edison's fundamental insight regarding a high-resistance filament for the lamp. The Englishman Joseph Swan was using a carbon element in his lamps, and another fellow Briton, a fellow named St. George Lane Fox, was also experimenting along promising lines. But neither one had the resources Edison commanded or his understanding of the many problems to be solved in creating a practical electrical system. He had to design workable lamps. He had to design sockets, switches, fuses, a meter, motors, wires, circuits, dynamos, to say nothing of figuring out ways to manufacture them. Once he'd figured out what they needed to look like, he had to design everything. Swan did assemble a system, this Englishman, in the early 1890s, but only after Edison had done it and proved it was possible. Without that, it's dubious that the investors would have bought into Swan's system. Now, within a decade, as I said, probably the German firm of Siemens or Edison's American competitor Thomson Houston or another clear-sighted and broadly inventive electrical innovator would have put the necessary insights together. But even that delay would have altered so much that it's hard to know where to start when we think about changes and what would have been different. The changes that were enabled and that were encouraged by the distribution of handy electric light and power were vast and they were innumerable. Everything from having rooms in a building that don't have windows, so you don't need light, having light in mines, having power. Many great electrical inventors in America and overseas were inspired by Edison's work. Many of them were nurtured in his factories and laboratories. Frank Sprague, who introduced the first successful streetcars, worked with Edison. Nikola Tesla, another important inventor, worked in an Edison facility in Europe.
Someone's calling.
Came to the U.S. to work with Edison. A radio inventor named Reynold Fessenden, a fellow named Charles Steinmetz who worked for GE. a Nobel Prize-winning chemist named Irving Langmuir, all of these people would have had entirely different careers, could not have done what they did without Edison because the companies wouldn't have been there. George Westinghouse had made his money on railroad air brakes. He started manufacturing alternating current equipment in competition with Edison. His equipment was used in Niagara Falls. That would not have happened when it happened. It would have been much later that Niagara Falls would have become a generating station. 1895 is when it actually opened. Moreover, in the U.S., that explosive development, just the way computers have exploded in the last 30 years, was responsible for altering American education. Engineering education became far more important when it was realized that you had to teach people electricity, and people had to do that in a university. Physics, which had been a really minor discipline, became the most important, the best funded discipline, had the biggest laboratories at the universities. What Edison brought to that project, as he did everything else, was this team and this laboratory, which allowed him to accomplish a great deal in a short time. And he also had access to the deep pockets of Wall Street, the financial community in New York, and nobody else had their attention. The reason he had it was because of the telegraph and because of the phonograph. This wonderful thing, the phonograph. 1877, Edison invents this thing using a little tinfoil and a needle, and he records sound. He records the human voice. It's the one invention that really came to Edison unbidden. He wasn't looking for it. He surprised himself. He was trying to invent something, an accessory for the telephone. He tried something and realized a couple of hours later that he hadn't recorded a telephone message. He had recorded sound, and all of a sudden there was the phonograph. It's it's a wonderful story. And it's in our volume, which you can buy at the local drugstore, or at least see at the local research library or local public library. Other people had recorded sound waves by having a little needle scratch a record, but nobody had recorded it in a way that made them think you could play it back. He used it in dolls. He used it, he has a wonderful picture of a phonograph he's making for a courtroom, and it says heavy metal on it. And I've always wondered what he knew. And nobody else knew at the time, it's heavy metal phonograph. It was a development worthy of Thomas Huxley's assessment of Charles Darwin's fundamental insight. When Huxley heard about Darwin's basic ideas, he said, how perfectly stupid of me not to have thought of that. And Alexander Graham Bell, after hearing about Edison's phonograph, said, it is a most astonishing thing to me that I could have let this invention slip through my fingers. It also gave Edison and his boys a chance to play. This is a guy who was so audacious that he dared to invent an improvement on a poem written in 1830 by Sarah Hale. I'm deliberately being obscure. It was a poem that Edison used to test his phonograph, and his first improvement went something like this. Mary had a little lamb, it jumped up to the sky, and when it came back to the ground, it said, how's that for high? Now you have to know that how's that for high was an expression meaning cool, huh? They would use that in the lab. And when it got really late at night, they'd say things like, Mary has a new sheath dress, it is too tight by half. Who gives a damn for Mary's lamb when we can see her calf? Those racy Victorian boys, watch out for them. Now, even if someone else had invented it, then or later, and it could have been the next day, the next week, the next year, or it could have been 20 years later, it's that kind of thing. The talking metal foil phonograph was just a curiosity. It wasn't practical. It wasn't until the middle of the 1880s when a nephew of Alexander Graham Bell's and another worker came to Edison and said, we have this better idea for your phonograph. And Edison said to himself, nobody is going to improve my phonograph. And he went to work with his team and developed a new phonograph, a good steady motor, and what was very important, a good material for making these phonograph records. Nobody else could have done that as fast as he did with the kind of facilities that he had. For the next 3 decades, his phonograph sales and recording companies defined this new area of consumer entertainment. And it just hadn't existed before. You had having music in your house that wasn't being produced by somebody. He saved a lot of young women from having to learn piano to entertain the guests when they came over. He also unfortunately chose the recording artist, and he was extremely deaf at that point, which wasn't a good idea, but he could not be persuaded of that. But it wasn't the only thing he was doing in the late 1880s. He had encountered some photographers, a fellow named Edouard Muybridge and a Frenchman named Marais, and that piqued his interest in the possibility of moving pictures, of doing, as he said, doing for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear. For 25 years, he and his production companies were at the center of American movie making. He invented the first good motion picture camera in America. He invented 35mm film, which pretty much remains unchanged today. A film historian observed that without Edison, we'd still have motion pictures, but they probably would have been an English or French invention, not an American one. The beginnings of motion pictures would have occurred later, and the technology been somewhat different. Rather than embracing America's vibrant popular culture, the first movies might have been more elitist and genteel. Rather than Errol Flynn, maybe we would have been watching more thoughtful, complex, soul-searching characters. Maybe Yves Montand would have played Jacques Bond, and Depardieu would be the modern action hero. Who knows? More subtle, again, in language. If Lumiere inventions had led the way, maybe today we'd be watching cine or loomies instead of movies, which is 1905 slang for moving pictures, and probably got kids got their mouth washed out for saying movies instead of motion pictures. Motion pictures were Edison's last great culturally formative enterprise, although by no means his last great venture. At the same time he was launching into motion pictures, he was starting up a huge iron mining and refining enterprise. It failed in the 1890s, and the machinery from that, he moved it into Portland cement manufacture. And besides Yankee Stadium, there were some cement houses built in northern New Jersey. They're still standing, but you haven't heard about them for a good reason. They were poured as entire houses. Everything is in the walls already, the plumbing, the wiring, and so on. They're probably very hard to repair, as you can imagine. In the 20th century, he also invented storage batteries, natural substitutes for tropical latex, became the head of Thomas A. Edison Incorporated, and none of these were fundamental developments. He was living in a world that he had partly devised, but he was no longer a primary moving force. As we look at the consequences of his inventions, of these large accomplishments, we're not talking about butterfly wings anymore. We're talking about Krakatoa, Mount St. Helens. We really shift beyond the power of analogy and even analysis, and we move into what can only be called ideology. It depends on what you think about history and how you want to interpret it. Without his electrical system of the early 1880s, this is the big historic picture, would American industrial capitalism have developed the same way? Well, probably would have. There were a lot of other things going on that were driving this new social enterprise. But who can say with electrical distribution so completely different in 1920, not nearly as advanced as it was in effect, what projects this fellow named Lenin would have envisioned as he cast about for technological programs and models for his new country? In the event, he said, as it happened, he said that the driving force behind his grandiose plans was his belief that electricity plus socialism equals communism. You have this network, you have a centralization of power, of literal power. Edison himself became an icon of technological progress across the globe. There's a wonderful Punch cartoon from the turn of the century showing people floating around in midair wearing Edison's anti-gravity underclothing. They had a museum with walls about this high, and people were floating up the walls looking at the pictures. He was claimed by surprising places. There's a 1909 article from a Mexican newspaper claiming Edison was actually born in Zacatecas, Mexico, and that his name was Tomás Alva Edison, and that the U.S. had merely stolen him. I understand there's a plaque down there that still says that. Whatever. An Uruguayan essayist who is very famous in Latin America, a man named Jose Enrique Rodó, wrote a work in 1900 called Ariel, in which he said, North America thinks it can rewrite Genesis to the tune of Washington plus Edison, meaning democracy and technology. Edison's fame was sustained by his organizational and entrepreneurial drive into the 20th century. Now, in a classic story, which many of you may have read, called A Sound of Thunder, writer Ray Bradbury looked into this question of historical contingency, of what depends on what. He has a time traveler going back to the Cretaceous to shoot a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and he stumbles off the path he's supposed to stay on, and when he gets back to a slightly changed future, there's a butterfly crushed under his foot. Bradbury's conclusion is the same one that philosophers have reached for 2,000 years, and probably longer, that everything is hitched to everything, and that disturbing anything more or less disturbs everything. In trying to gauge the effects of Edison's life, we're confronted by this series of causal cascades, some of them larger than others. The path that leads to the electric tattoo needle doesn't have any obvious consequences. Although I guess George Shultz wouldn't have had that tiger tattooed in that awkward place. If those of you who may remember that story, he was the Secretary of State. Others, like imagining the consequences of not establishing Menlo Park as a research facility, are unimaginable. We really can't think. There's so much that was changed by Edison establishing this place and showing people how to do research and how to invent in a corporate environment, that we really have to leave the consequences to writers of speculative fiction. We just don't know. Niels Bohr, in other words, was only half right. It's just as hard to predict the past as it is to predict the future. Now, I once saw a cartoon of Edison showing him at the moment of inspiration for the electric lamp. And it was a really wonderful drawing, and it says a lot, as only artists can do. And I'll leave you with this image. In the drawing, Edison is standing holding this lamp, and he's looking at it, and over his head in a thought balloon is a candle. So, thank you very much.
We do have a few minutes for questions, maybe 5 minutes if you'd like to come to the microphone. We alternate between the two mics, as you know.
Could you comment on the argument between Edison and, I guess it was Steinmetz or Tesla, about AC versus DC?
Well, it was George Westinghouse. It was his principal competitor. Tesla had worked for Westinghouse and developed a practical AC motor, which was really the last stumbling block for alternating current. Edison didn't like alternating current because he thought it was dangerous. There was a lot of public debate. There were animals electrocuted in public displays on the way to the electric chair, which was not Edison's idea, but which he didn't discourage because he thought that AC was so dangerous. This was a good way to demonstrate it, and of course cast some shadows over his competition. But it was a fascinating episode. Alternating current has the tremendous advantage of allowing transmission at a great distance, which direct current doesn't. And that would certainly, although now there are methods of transmitting direct current large distances, at the time that was not the case. It was a very lively debate, and there's actually been some very good scholarship written about it. But fundamentally, Edison's problem was that he just didn't trust it. He didn't think it was safe. And then later on, it's fair to say, as alternating current developed, that it got beyond Edison's capacity to be a pioneer. But he did experiment with it. He worked with it. He tried to develop systems. He just finally stayed with DC.
Do you have any information on how Edison thought and some of the tricks of creativity, such as the naps? Or, was that a trick? Did that work?
Well, he was somebody who didn't need to sleep a lot and liked to take short naps. He did wind up sleeping a fair amount each day, but didn't usually sleep more than 4 hours a night, and he'd just knock off and take naps during the day. We have learned some things about what he did. I don't know how helpful it is. It's interesting to read. We find, for example, that one of the things he would do is, if he hit an obstacle that he really didn't think he could eliminate, he'd find a way to minimize it. He'd just leave it there, and he'd swamp it with what he wanted to do. This was true in telegraph technologies. If he simply could not think of a way to make something work that didn't involve this defect, he would make everything else much bigger than the defect. So the defect was still there. It was just unimportant. And part of it was he was Edison. There's a story, there was a newspaper article in which the reporter interviewed Edison and a couple of his lieutenants, and they're sitting around a table, and the reporter asked a question. And Edison had a very close relationship with the press. It came out of his telegrapher years. He had friends who were reporters. He fed them information when it was useful, and used the press his whole life for his image. But he's talking with this fellow, and he said, the reporter said, well, how did you do that? And Edison said, oh, it was obvious, it was just there, and we looked at it. And one of his coworkers said, no. He said, I was there, and it wasn't obvious to me. The difference is that you're Edison, and we're not. So finally, we've learned a lot about the way he invented and a lot about the way he worked. But like watching Michael Jordan play basketball or listening to Mozart, right? You can only get so far. You can talk about Mozart's harmonies and counterpoint and everything else, but finally the music's beautiful because he wrote it, and because he was Mozart.
You said that his deafness was probably brought out by scarlet fever. Does that mean that the myth that I've nurtured my whole life that he was pulled up by his ears is not true?
Yes. He might well have been picked up by his ears, or he might, in another version of the story, he was boxed on his ears because his chem lab fell over in the railroad car, and a stick of phosphorus, which needs to be kept immersed in water, burst into flame in contact with the atmosphere. That fell on the floor and started a fire, and that might have happened too. But it's pretty clear that his deafness was let's just say the best bet is that it was caused by disease. That kind of mastoiditis or scarlet fever was pretty common. Now, it's all amoxicillin, and then it was deafness.
What kind of books did he read other than what he needed to read for his inventions?
He read fiction. He loved Victor Hugo from the time he was a kid. He read anything. He read books later on when he was having problems with digestive issues later in life. He read books on, I'm trying to remember what it was called, not the irascible colon, but something as catchy a title as that. A great deal of technical and scientific material, but widely. When he tackled a problem, he got everything he possibly could on the state of the art, and he read it, and he subscribed to every journal he could get. His reading lists are wonderful, and his library is a wonderful place. He figured he could find it somewhere, and he'd go looking for it. Well, thank you very much.
You can imagine looking at the visuals.
Next, in our children's book segment, Gina Dare discusses the biography he's written for young adults called Thomas Alva Edison, Inventing the Electric Age. Mr. Edison patented more than 1,000 inventions, and Mr. Adair traces his life from growing up in Ohio through his life as the inventor of the electric light bulb. The author spoke earlier this month at Davis Kid Booksellers in Knoxville, Tennessee.
I'll be like, hello from over here. So we have getting all this gear there. I'm Tom Edison, Kitty Mess Coordinator. I've known Gene as a voice on the phone for a number of years. And I thought about me about 2 years ago personally.
Where is on the street? That's the deputy's daughter.
Is the one I talked to about. But Gene was one I had to write from. So I had to call Gene. So when Gene came in and said, well, I have written this book about Thomas Edison, it's a young adult title. And we were thrilled to have the book signed because I believe Gene in the publishing business, it was like he had this whole other life he had. And I was really thrilled to have him here tonight to talk about the book. And so right now, I'm going to turn it over to Gene. We'll get started. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. I want to begin by asking a simple question that you should all know the answer to. What's the first invention that pops into your head when you hear the name Thomas Alva Edison? Anyone? The light bulb. Can you think of any others? Okay. Any others? Right. Mm-hmm. Well, that's very good. In a way, Edison's name has become so associated with the light bulb that we often forget that he invented quite a few other things. In fact, he was active as an inventor for more than 50 years. He got his first patent when he was only 22 years old. And by the time he died at the age of 84, he'd been awarded nearly 1,100 patents. That was more than any other inventor. Early in his career, he made improvements to the telegraph and telegraphic devices. The stock ticker that you mentioned was one of those. And he also made improvements to the telephone, which of course originated with another inventor, Alexander Graham Bell. The first device, you mentioned the phonograph, the first device to record sound was Edison's invention. In fact, that was probably his most original invention. That was his favorite. He said when he invented it that this is my baby and I expect it to grow up and be a big fella and support me in my old age, which it actually did. He was also a central figure in the development of early motion pictures, so there are a lot of things that we owe to Edison. And even when you look at the light bulb, and look at electric lighting more closely, you realize very quickly that it wasn't just the bulb itself. One of the things Edison did was come up with a way of distributing electricity over long distances and thereby lighting cities and towns and eventually the rural landscape. The whole electric power industry, in effect, began with Edison. This was probably his greatest technical achievement and his greatest contribution to daily life as we know it today. Where would we be if we couldn't flick on a switch or plug an electrical cord into a wall socket? I was reminded of this about an hour ago as I was rehearsing the speech. A transformer in our neighborhood blew, and I had to finish my rehearsal with a flashlight. So it was brought home very strongly that way. But aside from the individual inventions, there's another very important contribution made that we often don't think about. He, in effect, invented a particular way of working on inventions. He began in the mid-19th century, like a lot of the inventors at that time, working in small workshops. He maybe had 1 or 2 people helping him. But by the time he set up his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey in 1876, he assembled a whole staff of about 20 to 30 people to help him work. And he called this facility his invention factory.
In this video
and in 1887, just 11 years later, he
constructed a much larger complex in West Orange, New Jersey. It was extremely well equipped. It initially employed about 100 people, and it carried out a broad range of research on everything from X-rays to storage batteries to concrete housing to electric automobiles. And these facilities, first at Menlo Park and later at West Orange, were the forerunners of the modern industrial laboratory, the sort of thing we have in nearby Oak Ridge. And what Edison did was to pull in investors. He was very good at attracting people who had money and getting them to invest in his inventions. And with that, he was able to buy the best equipment and hire the best personnel. Often it wasn't simply Edison working alone. He was the idea man behind a lot of the stuff, but he had a lot of people helping him. And this style of laboratory, this way of creating technological innovation, is today the center of what we call a research and development department within a modern corporation. So Edison was a transitional figure who kind of bridged the gap between the crude workshops of the 19th century and the multi-million-dollar facilities that carry out technical research today. And in fact, you could say he was one of the key figures, for better or worse, who helped transform America itself. In the 19th century, when he was born, we were still a struggling, largely agricultural nation. By the early 20th century, we were becoming an industrial superpower, and Edison did a lot to make all of that possible. He was a man with vision. He saw things on a very grand scale. He didn't think small. And yet, he wasn't just a dreamer. He wanted to make practical things that people would use. He sometimes scoffed at what he called theoretical scientists, although he employed quite a few on his staff. But he always invented things with an eye to making things that people would use. He was fiercely competitive, and he could even be ruthless in dealing with his rivals and protecting his patents and his inventions. And he had his failures, too. And when he failed, he sometimes failed big. The most spectacular failure came in the 1890s. He became involved in a scheme to refine iron ore using an electromagnetic process of separating iron from raw ore. He thought that this would make him millions, but in fact he ended up losing millions. The equipment was very complicated, it broke down regularly, and the iron it produced was of an inferior quality. He stuck with it for 10 years, being the persistent, stubborn man that he was, but finally had to close it down and then just sort of shrugged it off. He said, well, we lost a lot of money, but we sure had a lot of fun spending it. So he was always optimistic. There's another anecdote I like, that in 1914, a fire tore through his factory buildings surrounding his laboratory in West Orange. The laboratory, fortunately, was spared, but the factories where he manufactured phonographs and other products were going up in flames, and Edison's son Charles saw his father standing looking on with his arms folded and walked up to him, and Charles was in despair, but Edison turned to him and says, where's your mother? Get her here and all her friends too. They'll never see a fire like this again. And within days he was rebuilding. And all in all, he was a fascinating figure to write about. I thought I'd talk for a few minutes about how I came to this project and how I came to write about Thomas Edison. I didn't really know very much about him when I began. When I was a kid, I saw the old MGM movies, Young Tom Edison with Mickey Rooney and Edison the Man with Spencer Tracy. And I'd studied a bit about him in school and read what the encyclopedia had to say about him. I knew about the light bulb and the phonograph and even his early work in movies, but I knew it only in the most general way. Years later, in the 1970s, late 1970s, I was in graduate school studying film history and criticism at Columbia University. And I was taking a class in film research methods, and our instructor happened to be a big Edison buff. So he took us, we all met down at Port Authority bus terminal one day and took a bus over to West Orange to visit the Edison National Historic Site, where his laboratory is maintained by the National Park Service.
It says that
we toured Edison's library, his laboratory, and his workrooms, and we even went inside the Edison
studio.
archives where all the Edison papers and notebooks
I guess she's
are
got
stored.
nothing else going on.
And this trip made a big impression on me, but I still didn't know a lot about the details of his life, except for some about his work in the movie industry. After graduate school, I remained in New York for several more years working in book publishing, and through some of my contacts, I was able to get a contract writing a young adult biography of George Washington Carver. This was published by a company called Chelsea House in their Black Americans in Achievement series. The editor-in-chief of Chelsea House was a woman named Nancy Toff, and she subsequently went on to become a senior editor at Oxford University Press, and as a senior editor in the children's book and young adult books division. And by this time, I had come south. I was living and working at the time in Georgia at the University of Georgia Press. And on a visit back to New York in 1992, I got word that Nancy wanted to see me. So we set up a meeting, and she told me about a series of young adult books that she wanted to start at Oxford, and it would cover the lives of important scientists and scientific figures. And she liked my Carver book and asked me if I wanted to do a book in this series, and I said sure. And so we talked some more and decided, since I had some background in film, that Edison would be a good choice to write about. So immediately I went out to a bookstore and bought a paperback copy of Matthew Josephson's 1959 biography of Edison. After that, I read several others and several books about the fields that he worked in. And from all of this, I brought the information together into my own little book about Edison. During this time, my wife and I even went to Ohio for a family wedding, and it happened to be near Milan, which is where the Edison birthplace is located. We went there and toured that. And so I distilled this into my own book, and following the guidelines that Nancy had set for the series, I included not just a narrative of its life, but several sidebars about various inventions, like the phonograph and the electric light and motion picture devices. Oxford brought the book out in hardcover in this edition in 1996, and they were marketing it mainly to school libraries. They sent it out with its paperback edition, its trade paperback edition, which they marketed not just to young adult readers, but to any reader interested in a brief introductory biography of a famous scientific figure. They've also got books on Marie Curie and Albert Einstein and Darwin and several other scientists. As I was researching and writing the books, several things surprised and impressed me about Edison. First, I was struck by what a storybook figure he was. He had a life that could have been written by Horatio Alger. It was a classic rags to riches story. As I mentioned, he was born in the small town of Milan, Ohio in 1847. And when he was 7 years old, his family moved to Port Huron, Michigan, which is about 60 miles from Detroit. He had very little formal schooling. He probably went to school no more than a few months. He was taught mostly by his mother, Nancy, at home. She had been a school teacher. And he was, from a very early age, drawn to scientific things. He was especially interested in chemistry and in electricity. When he was 12 years old, he went to work full-time, which wasn't unusual in the 19th century. His first job was selling snacks and newspapers on the railroad line that connected Port Huron and Detroit. Every day he'd get up, go to work, and then walk up and down the aisles with his tray filled with his wares and sell them to the passengers on the train. But while he was working on the railroad, he got a close daily exposure to the telegraph, which was the most advanced form of communication at that time. And the telegraph went hand in hand with the rise of the railroad. Every train station had its telegraph office, and the telegraph operators would signal information about train movements to and from different stations. And so he decided at that point, well, why don't I become a telegraph operator, a telegrapher? And he knew a station master. He was pretty close to one of the station masters on the line, and he persuaded this man to give him telegraphy lessons. And after he mastered the craft at about the age of 16, he started wandering the country as a tramp telegrapher. He would go from one town to another, Cincinnati, Louisville, these were some of the towns. And he even spent some time in Memphis, so there's a Tennessee connection there. He worked for several months in its telegraph office. Eventually, more and more he was being attracted to inventing, and he was doing a lot of tinkering with telegraph instruments on the side. And eventually he went to Boston and tried to get a start as an inventor there, but his enterprises there didn't do very well, so he decided to try his luck in New York City. And so he borrowed some money for the boat fare and ended up on the west side of Manhattan and didn't even have a place to stay that night. He had to wander the streets because he didn't have the price of a bed. But it was in New York, within just a few months and a few years, that he established himself as a successful freelance inventor. He did a lot of work for Western Union, which was the biggest of the telegraph companies, and its various subsidiaries, working on the stock ticker, which was used in the financial markets to report stock prices. One of his first major inventions was the quadruplex, which was a telegraph that could send 4 messages simultaneously on one wire. And this became a big bone of contention among competing who would own the quadruplex, and because it could increase the amount of business that a telegraph company could do using existing wires. And so he got involved in a big lawsuit over this, and it was one of many lawsuits that he would get involved in over the years. After he set up his lab in Menlo Park in 1876, he worked on improvements to the telephone. He continued work on the telegraph, and he invented the phonograph, which caused a huge sensation. That was when he was first dubbed the Wizard of Menlo Park, and by this time he was all of 30 years old. After the phonograph came the electric light and the first installation of an electric power system in New York City. And it was from his work here that he became very wealthy and was able to set up his complex in West Orange. In the years that followed, he manufactured phonographs, he made movies. His lab produced an alkaline storage battery, which became very successful. And he kept working right up to the very end of his life. Even after he retired, 2 of his friends, Henry Ford, the automaker, and Harvey Firestone, the tire maker, were very concerned about foreign monopolies of the rubber supply, so they wanted Edison to come up with a way of finding a domestic source of rubber, and he worked on this almost until the day he died in 1931. And you can't help but be impressed when you look at his life by his just sheer dogged persistence. You've probably all heard the most famous saying attributed to Edison, that genius consists of 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. The electric light, for example, was an amazing story. It took him over a year to perfect the light, and then another year to perfect the electrical distribution system. When they were working on the light bulb, the biggest problem was finding the right filament, the little wire inside the bulb that glows when the light's switched on. Inventors have been trying for years to use this principle to come up with a practical light, and Edison just got on the problem and stuck with it. It was interesting that one of the materials he thought was going to work was platinum, which of course is extremely expensive. It's a precious metal, and one of his people estimated that a single platinum light bulb would cost $99. So you can see that this wasn't a very practical route to go. But it was only through hard work that he eventually found a material that was quite cheap and readily available, carbon. He used first a carbonized cardboard as his filament, eventually used carbonized bamboo. It was only much later that the tungsten filament that we have today was used. Edison actually experimented with tungsten, but at the time it's a very hard metal, and the tools he had available to him at the time, they weren't able to shape it into a wire thin enough to serve as a filament. He discovered that there was a downside to his persistence. Sometimes it could turn into stubbornness. I mentioned the iron ore fiasco earlier. But his electrical distribution system became a problem later on when he had based his original system on a low voltage direct current. And some years later, a competitor, George Westinghouse, working from a man named Tesla, who had worked for Edison, working from his ideas, Westinghouse began promoting a high-voltage alternating current system. And it was much superior to Edison's original system because it could distribute electricity over a much longer distance, and it could do so much more cheaply and efficiently than Edison's system. But Edison had started out with direct current, and by golly, he was going to stick with direct current. And he fought Westinghouse tooth and nail. But eventually, the Westinghouse system prevailed, and that's basically what we have today. Similarly, the original phonograph that Edison developed used I'll show you a picture of it from the book. The original phonograph used a cylindrical design, which you can see here. And the records that he produced were little cylinders. They were like little black tubes. As the cylinder rotated, the stylus would move across the cylinder. But then another inventor, a German named Emil Berliner, came along and invented the flat disc record. Edison's cylinders had somewhat better sound reproduction, so Edison was very stubborn about entering into the disc market. But the discs had longer playing times, and they were, of course, a lot easier to store. They took up a lot less space. And so eventually Edison had to give in and start manufacturing disc-type records and phonographs himself. And in learning about these battles, I couldn't help but be reminded of some of the technological competitions we have going on today. You remember a few years back when home video recorders first came in, there were these two competing formats, Beta and VHS, and eventually VHS won out. More recently, we've had the personal computer wars, the battle between say the Apple Macintosh platform and the Microsoft's DOS-based Windows platform. And in studying Edison's life, I couldn't help but draw parallels, and it was really interesting for me to discover that these competitive clashes between competing technologies were nothing new. That Edison was dealing with similar kinds of battles 100 years ago. On that note, I think I'll just stop and open up the floor to questions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the electric cars. Mm-hmm. What was his contribution to were electric vehicles?
Batteries? Yes, using batteries. In fact, he had originally developed when he was working on the alkaline storage battery, his thought was to use it as a way of powering electric cars. But eventually, people like Henry Ford came along with the internal combustion engine, and the electric car kind of declined. But it's interesting that a lot of the early auto designs involved electricity, and Edison was very involved in that for a number of years.
Using motors too?
I think so, yes. In fact, there's a picture in my book of Edison on yeah, this is one right here that Edison was posing on.
He didn't manufacture his own auto?
No, he just experimented with them, and after it became apparent to him that the internal combustion engine was going to rule the day, he sort of backed out of that particular technology. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
He was a contemporary with J.P. Morgan.
Oh, yes. Morgan was one of his investors, in fact.
But he never became involved in some of those.
No. Well, I think for one reason was that he never really pursued money for its own sake. He basically was interested in making money so that he could make inventions. That was what powered him. He would work these 16-hour work days, and I don't think money was ever the big attraction to him. He didn't really get into it. Even when he got involved in the iron ore fiasco, he wanted to make something. He thought he could make a lot of money at it, but when he didn't, he just kind of shrugged the whole thing off. Yes. Good question. He was married twice. His first wife died. I think she hadn't even turned 30 when she died, apparently of a brain tumor. But he was sort of noted for neglecting both his wives. Apparently, he courted them very ardently. But once they tied the knot, he'd go back to the laboratory and work for 16 hours a day. His wife, Mina, his second wife, I think was a lot better at dealing with it than Mary Stilwell, his first wife. And she remarked toward the end of his career when he got involved in the rubber thing, he says, everything has turned to rubber in our family. We think rubber, we eat rubber, we dream rubber. But he wasn't the model husband and father, really, because he was at home so seldom. And it's funny that he built a winter home in Fort Myers, Florida, and this is supposed to be where he would, go to relax. But he very quickly put in a laboratory there so that he could work when he was away from New Jersey.
There's 1,100 patents. Just amazing. Itself. Were they all within certain general categories, or were they spread out?
They were spread out, and it's kind of funny if you look at a list of them, you can kind of see the trajectory of his career. Like all of his early patents had to do with telegraphic devices, then there were devices having to do with electric lighting and the phonograph and so on. He did conduct a very, very broad range of research, and not all of it went anywhere. He got involved in X-ray technology and so forth, and nothing much came out of that. And like the electric automobiles, like I mentioned, he even got involved in an electric train system while he was working on the electric light. He built a train that would be powered by electricity, and this could have been a big accomplishment. But he was very involved in coming up with the electric lights, and other inventors kind of came in and started working in trains, so he just sort of left it to him. I hope that answers your question.
I understand that this was around the time of the Statue of Liberty, but didn't he have actually a light bulb?
That I don't know.
It was a very weak one.
That's entirely possible. I really don't know the specifics of that one.
Yeah. There's a closed over there that started the National Geographic. Was there some connection there that you found? It seems to me, I think it was right up at the magazines.
Possibly, yeah. His wife, his second wife, her family was rather prominent. The Miller family back in Ohio. Her father was an inventor himself and worked in farm implements and that sort of thing.
I think you're right. That's pursuing Tom Hardy did something just the rest of the story is about that.
I was interested in what you had to say about his education, that he was not particularly well educated. No. He had a knowledge of science, and I'm wondering how deep that knowledge was, and whether he always saw science only in practical terms.
I think he did. Supposedly, when he was a young boy, when he was working on the railroad, he went to Detroit and enrolled in the Young Men's Society. He had a library, and he used to boast years later that he had read the entire library, though he was probably stretching the truth. And one of the books that he struggled through was Isaac Newton's famous opus, the Principia. And he said that the only thing he took from that was a distaste for mathematics that has lasted me the rest of my life. Right, and as I mentioned, he often sort of spoke condescendingly or disdainfully of what he called the theoretical scientists. But that didn't keep him later on from hiring a lot of university-trained science people, like Francis Upton, who was very instrumental in developing his generator and working on the problems of the electric light. And he hired him at Menlo Park. He had advanced degrees from Princeton and had studied in Germany. So he recognized their talents and their, even though he himself was always kind of a seat of the pants kind of inventor. Does that answer your question, Scott? Are there any other questions? Oh, sure, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Why don't we start, since I have to move some chairs, why don't we start right here on this lap? Got a pen, Gene?
Actually, I didn't bring one.
This is artificial.
Oh, okay. All right.
You don't have to buy perfume, so nobody's.
Could I describe it to you? Okay. To Joe? Okay, that's my first name. And okay.
Gene Adair's book, Thomas Alva Edison, is part of a series of biographies written for young adults and published by Oxford University Press. The series is called Portraits of Science. Other titles include biographies of Alexander Graham Bell, Charles Darwin, Marie Curie, and Isaac Newton. You can learn more about the series by visiting Oxford University Press's website, www.oxford.com.
Richard Moran is author of Executioner's Current, Thomas Edison, George Westinghouse, and the Invention of the Electric Chair. It's the story behind the struggle for control of New York's electric market in the late 19th century. This History on Book TV feature runs about 50 minutes.
Thanks. It's a great pleasure to introduce my friend Richard Moran, who's known to many of you in this room, lots of people. Even if you don't know him by face, you may know his voice as a commentator for some years on National Public Radio's Morning Edition. You may also know him as a contributor to the op-ed pages of most of the country's major newspapers, including the New York Times, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post. Since we have a larger audience today, I'll continue to play resume for a moment and tell people who don't know that he has been a professor of sociology here at Mount Holyoke College for 125 years. That's what he told me. I think that's right. He's the author of Knowing Right from Wrong, The Insanity Defense of Daniel McNaughton, and of the brand new book he'll be discussing tonight, Executioner's Current, Thomas Edison, George Westinghouse, and the Invention of the Electric Chair. It's a pleasure to introduce Richard, not least because he has loyally attended readings by my husband and me at the Odyssey over the years. Richard has been a loyal friend in more ways than one. He and his wife Danielle even offered me the use of the electrified gazebo on the beautiful grounds of their house to write in. That gazebo was surely the inspiration for my husband's gift to me of a writing gazebo some years later, though this one was not electrified. I hope by now that you have noted my clever and offhand use of the word electrified. Richard Moran's new book, Executioner's Current, is a history not only of the electric chair's invention and implementation, but of its justification, or some people's attempts, whether well-meaning or self-serving, at its justification. What I like very much about Richard Moran's new book is what I like about Richard. And perhaps the best way to talk about that is to remind us, in case anybody's forgotten, that this is Election Day. I've never asked Richard to tell me his party affiliation, but whatever it is nominally, he is always at heart an independent. You cannot predict what he will say. Or even if, on an off chance, you can predict what side he's on, you won't be able to predict why. He has a way of introducing a single historical fact or a conjunction of seemingly unrelated statistics into a conversation and completely shifting its focus. You realize that you were out of focus. But Richard's manner is so genial that you feel genuinely glad to be corrected. A few remarks about Executioner's Current. It is, like Richard Moran, unclassifiable. It begins with an execution, the first by electric chair in the United States, and ends with the trial that led up to it. But somehow the suspense is even keener after you know what will happen. It's a history of science, and yet we come away with a vivid understanding of certain certain misunderstandings about electricity by the great Edison himself. It's a history of patents, marketing, public relations, and just plain lying. It is a courtroom thriller and a historical novel that happens to be true. It's an evocation of a past that never condescends to the past or makes previous generations quainter or more wiser, or our own wiser. Finally, it is in its last pages a political and philosophical argument for self-reflection. How humane are we human beings really? In splitting hairs over which form of capital punishment is more humane, are we missing the point? But as I've said before, Richard Moran is an independent, so I will let him make the point himself. Please welcome Mount Holyoke Professor of Sociology and my good friend, Richard Moran.
That really was a lovely introduction, but it's going to be hard to follow. As you all know, I wrote this book about the electric chair, and I thought what I would do tonight is a little bit what I've done in the introduction to the book, which is to tell you how and why I got interested in the electric chair. Now, my first encounter with the electric chair actually occurred when I was a small boy growing up beneath the shadow of the bridge that separates Boston from its northern suburbs. On a hot summer afternoon, my mother took my brother and me down to Bellingham Square to see a full-scale model of the electric chair, as well as a replica of the prison cells. I don't really remember whether the state of Massachusetts or the city of Chelsea ran the exhibit, but I shall never forget the grim lesson of crime and punishment that it was designed to teach. If you did something bad, if you did something wrong, then they would get you in the end. My mother was always afraid that something would happen to us. She was afraid of accidents. She was afraid that we'd be the victims of crime. And she was also afraid that she would lose us to the streets. She always said that little criminals committed little crimes, and big criminals grew up from little criminals to commit big crimes. And yet you don't start out on death row. It's something you have to work on getting to. Well, that night, my brother and I both had nightmares. I remember being strapped into the chair. Naturally, I was innocent of the crime that had brought me to this dreadful moment, but somehow the evidence against me was both strong and incontrovertible. I woke up in a cold sweat just as the executioner pulled the switch. As I struggled to gain my bearings, my brother burst out of his nightmare, and we just kind of looked at each other for a little while and then rolled over and went back to sleep. To this day, I can't really shake the feeling of being strapped into the chair and being condemned to die for a crime that the real me didn't commit, although my brother seems to have forgotten the incident entirely. My second encounter with the electric chair came almost 20 years later when I was a graduate student at Northeastern University. My professor, the late Stephen Schaefer, asked me to take over a class and bring them to a tour of Walpole, which was the maximum security prison, state of Massachusetts. Near the end of the tour, the guard took us to death row, which had been abandoned for more than 25 years. Over in the corner was the old electric chair, the one used to execute, among others, the Italian anarchist Niccolo Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti in the 1920s. To my surprise, the guard asked me if I wanted to sit down. Well, I was kind of maybe 22 or 24 years old, and I was leading the group of students who were only a few years younger. So put on the spot and not wanting to appear too cowardly, I sat down. And I first, of course, looked over at the switchboard to make sure that it really hadn't been used in 25 years. But I sat there and contemplated what it might be like to be executed. On the way out, the guard said to me that in all the years he had been running this tour, I was the only one who had ever taken him up on his offer. So I kind of like to joke that I'm the last man to sit in the electric chair in Massachusetts, and really the only one to ever get up. Now, my third encounter with the electric chair was the occasion for my book here, although the route it took was somewhat indirect. For some time, I had been interested in the social transformation of the death penalty, how our ideas about the nature of punishment had changed over the years. I began my inquiry with the observation that new methods of execution developed during periods of mounting opposition to the penalty of